So, Evan Thomas, thank you so much for coming in today. I really appreciate you being here. Okay, hi everybody. Welcome back to ASMR Money Mentor. This is going to be part 2, where I react to what I just shared with you in part 1. So, if you didn't get a chance to see part 1 of myself talking to my former self in 2012 before I was a guest on the Susie Orman Show, go back and watch that episode first, and then I'll meet you here for part 2. Because in part 2, I am now maybe filling in some of the gaps about what I had talked about, and I'm going to do my best to make this relaxing for you and tie together how this can perhaps happen for you in the future as well, if you make the right choices with money. I'm not sure if I'm going to make this black and white like I make the first one. I don't know. We'll see when I go into production, post-production of the episode. But I also want to say that I believe I made a little bit of a mistake in how I was talking to you or talking to my former self in that first episode. Do you remember when I was talking about the fact that I had net income of $3,336 a month? So I should have mentioned that that is, of course, after tax and after what I was contributing to my 401k. Because remember how when you build your budget, your operating budget is after tax and after what you're putting into either a pre-tax or post-tax bucket into a 401k if you have a 401k. Does that make sense? And then you have another tab on your spreadsheet to add up all of your saving and investing. So the 3336 was after tax, and I'll give you those numbers in a minute, and after the total dollar amount that I'm contributing to my 401k, or that I contributed to my 401k in 2012, which was the max, which I'll also share with you here in just a moment as well. I also, when I listened back to that part 1, got a little confused at the end because I said that, of course, my true expenses in 2012 were $2,650. Now remember, true expenses includes things like mortgage. I had a mortgage back then, association fees, etc. Everything I gave you in that rundown. But that $2,650 as a true expense does not include savings expense. So then I went on to say that I also was saving $270 into my emergency fund, and also $416 into my Roth IRA to max that out to the total dollar amount of $5,000 back in 2012. Because a Roth IRA, as you know, is after tax money. You're funding a Roth IRA with money that you already paid taxes on. So all of your contributions into a Roth IRA, again, after tax, from your paycheck into whatever company you choose to use, Vanguard, Charles Schwab, Fidelity, etc., to fund your Roth IRA. And so when I was producing part 1, I kind of stalled at the end, if you will remember, and I said that I had $686 left, but really that was going into the savings of the Roth and the emergency fund because I wanted the budget to net to zero. You always want your budget to net to zero. Anything above and beyond your expenses, fun, and other is a line item going into savings and investing, so you net it to zero. And in fact, you might recall me saying when I was a guest on the Susie Orman Show, these numbers, by the way, were preparing for the Susie Orman Show. The numbers I gave you was the spreadsheet that I gave them, the producer. And if you went back and watched the episode that I was on in 2012, I give all of those details in another episode of my channel. I don't have all that detail right now, but I was a guest in 2012. It aired in July, and the episode was called Gut Check. You can watch it on Amazon. Anyway, interestingly enough, in that episode, Susie Orman said to me, "You only have was wanting my budget to net to zero. Yeah. Anyway, so I found that interesting. But then, so I also I have some numbers here to share with you to kind of bring it into perspective of how much I was really saving and investing in 2012. So again, the first thing I wanted to mention was that 3336 after tax and after what I put to my 401k. Now, if you go back and watch my episodes for 2012, my income, which included a salary and a bonus, was right around $70,000. $70,000. I wrote some rough estimates here to share with you. Let's subtract $18,000 because that would represent taxes. Now we have $52,000. $17,000 goes into my 401k. That was the max that you could put into 401k in 2012. I was 46 years old. I wasn't doing catch-up contributions, so let's subtract 17. Now we have $35,000. Let's subtract out my true expenses of $29,000. Now remember that number, $29,000. We're subtracting out $29,000 of true expenses. Remember, that's things like mortgage, association, etc. Because if you take $2,650 times 12, I think it is about $29,000 or $30,000, right? Anyway, let me continue on. Minus 29 gives you $64,000. Wait, I'm not doing that right, am I? 71 minus 18 minus 17 minus 29 gives us 7,000. Well, we have to subtract out the 5,000 that went into the Roth, right? The $416 a month minus 5 gives us 2,000 or 3,000. That was the amount of money I was putting into my emergency fund. So there you go. That is a bigger pick rundown of the total from gross to net to after what goes into your 401k, if you have a 401k, and then expenses and everything taken out, including savings, to net to zero. So I wanted to put that into perspective. I also wanted to share with you then that, remember, in part 1, my 2012 self wanted to get to a $1.5 million net worth in about 13 years. And in fact, I really didn't think of it that way. I just felt like, how could I maximize every single year going forward? So what we're essentially doing is reverse engineering into the past. And I was doing a role play to show you what's possible with discipline going forward. So I reversed engineered back. Now, I also want to share with you that if you Google it right now and you ask Google or any search engine, what was the S&P 500 return from 2012 till today's date, like in 2024, it's roughly 13%, which is really a big number. You may have heard me say in previous episodes that for you guys in the future and for myself, we don't know if a 13-year time frame will give 13% in the S&P 500. It might be 9%, maybe 10%. In fact, Vanguard is saying for the next decade, from, right now and 10 years forward, it would probably be, don't quote me on this, I think it was a lot less though than the 13%, maybe 10, maybe 8%, somewhere in there. So always remember that we can't change what the markets will do in the future. You just have to do the best you can. Now, I did do an analysis, and I thought I ran some numbers, and remember how in the last episode I said at 10% we would get to the 1.5 million in 13 years, but if you just did 6%, you would get to a million, and not that additional 500,000. So a million is still great, right? So always keep that into perspective, that your goal as much as you can in the year that you are in. Okay. So let me look at my notes here. The 2012, okay, I already mentioned this, but I was saving into my 401k the $17,000. But I also wanted to know how much was I really saving and investing in 2012, because remember I said that I would have had to save on average $31,000 for 13 years, which equaled $400,000 to get to the $1.5 million at a 10%. And then remember the interest, dividends, and unrealized gains in that equation would have been about $900,000. So after I produced part one, I wanted to anchor back to how much was I really saving in 2012. Well, if you take the $17,000 401k plus the $5,000 Roth plus $3,000 in matches, because remember I always include matches from my company into my 401k as income, and then I subtract it out. So again, $17,000, let's add it up. $17,000 into my 401k in 2012. $5,000 Roth IRA makes $22,000 plus $3,000 into the money market. Let me see if I did that right. 17 plus 5 plus 3 plus 3. It's $28,000. Let me do that again. 401k $17,000, $5,000 Roth, $3,000 matches, and $3,000 into my money market is $28,000. See how close that is to the $31,000 that I said I'd have to save to get to the $400,000 in 13 years. Does that make sense? So even back in 2012, I was very close to saving and investing the $31,000. And remember I said you could actually save less in those first years and then increase it a little bit every year. And I was already on that path for a very long time. That first $200,000 that I had saved and invested was from 2005 all the way through 2011. How many years is that? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. That's 7 years right now, which is also included, as you know, the recession. But of course I wasn't saving that much in those years. It didn't come until a little bit later. Now, one of the last things I want to share with you in this episode is that, remember, I was making $71,000 in 2012 as a total income for my salary and my bonus. That's gross income. So, you know, if you just divide that by 2 after you take taxes out, it's like a 50% savings rate. So at 56 years old, I had a 50% savings rate. So now let's circle back to you, right? Because this channel is all about you guys thinking about your own financial future from the aspect of somebody that has built wealth slowly over time. So how can you take this information away and use it to think about your own financial life? The first thing I'd like to say is that for those of you that have not yet really worked on your budget, that's clearly number one. You have to master your budget for the year that you're in. Not just the month that we're in right now, but also 12 months. Do you remember how I talked about that in previous episodes? You need to master the year that you are in. You need to know exactly where you are right now and how much you have to save and invest if you can, in fact, save and invest right now. You may not be able to, and that's perfectly fine. You may need to spend the next 5 years paying down debt. That is also perfectly fine. I mean, think about it. I didn't start saving and investing until I was 40 years old, really. So by the time I got to 46, because I kept my expenses low, I was able to get to a 50% savings rate. And then those next 13 years were huge in terms of the ability to build wealth. So don't feel bad if you don't have that ability to do it right now. But number one, suggest that you go back and you start thinking in a 5-year increment. Forecast out 2025, 2026, 2027, 2028, 2029. We're almost then to the end of a decade, and we're going to be then going into the 30s. The 2030s, right? So on your spreadsheet, start then thinking about a 5-year time frame. If you have debt, and if you're sending $200 a month or $300 a month, and you are, chiseling away at that debt, create your spreadsheets in advance and start thinking about how long will it take you to pay down that debt, all the while then not spending more on your credit cards, right? We're going to have to stop the bleeding. We're going to have to stop that behavior so that you can then take those line items, remember, and then just rename them. So if you were spending $200 a month on debt repayment, and suddenly you then pay that off, you can then switch the line item, just call it savings or investing. And then when you build your budget, you're going to earmark those funds for your savings and investing. Once you master your 5-year plan, then you want to amp it up to a 10-year plan. So that way, then you go to the dinkytown.net calculators that I've talked about, and you just start dreaming about what's really possible. Is it possible for you to get to 500,000? Is it possible for you to get to 800,000? Is it possible for you to get to $1 million? And how many years will that take? Remember, in part 1 of this episode, or this 2-part series, I should say, I was hoping that it would be at 10%, because when you look back at history, the markets usually do return about 10%. But remember, the further out you go, the more accurate that 10% is. It just so happens that part of my journey did include a lot of luck, in that the S&P 500, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, in the past 13 years, returned 13%. We may not get that lucky for the next 10 or 13 years, but who cares, right? We're still going to do what we're going to do. So instead of putting in a 10%, in fact, I did put, in part 1, I put a 10% only because I was reverse engineering, and I knew that markets were good. But just maybe forecast, instead of a 10%, be a little more conservative, maybe do a 6%. Remember, I said a little while ago in this episode that if I did get only 6% annual rate of return over the past 13 years, I would have still got to $1 million. Remember that 900,000 of interest, dividends, and unrealized gain that I got. Take away 500, and then of course we would get to $1 million as opposed to the 1.5, and that's still good. That's the way you have to look at it. Markets are going to do what markets are going to do. You're going to do what you're going to do. And your behavior, in many cases, will indicate your success above and beyond the market returns, because most people can't even find the discipline to save the amount of money that I have been able to save in the past, 10 or 13 years. Now, you also have to then, in the next 5, 10 years in this equation, is also think about what is your capacity to be able to have an income that continues to go up. This equation only can happen if you have the capacity in terms of income. So it may be that you and your partner then both have to get a job, right? Some people can do it on a single income, but you would have to be making quite a bit of money, if that makes sense. So the success, again, is based on your ability to keep that income going up. But most importantly, and I'm going to end the episode today by sharing with you that as I was thinking through what I was going to share with you today, I also think that guys know what lifestyle creep is, right? It's that expenses in your life continue to go up. And yes, things do get expensive. You know, we have inflation, we have all sorts of things. But you always have to have in the forefront of your mind that your expenses need to be low as you go forward. So just to share with you, in 2012, remember my expenses were, let me do that calculation now that we can. Remember, it was my true expenses. 2650 times 12. Yeah, 31,000. That included, remember, the mortgage of 587 and $600 that I was also putting towards the principal. Now let me pause for a minute. Some of you know that I did take Susie Orman's advice and I stopped contributing $600 extra to my principal in the mortgage. I refinanced my loan from a 5.5% 30-year fixed to a 3.25% 15-year fixed, which increased my capacity to get my savings and investing up because Susie said, you don't know what's going to happen in the future. You may lose your job. And I'm like, yeah, she's right. Now, in retrospect, that did not happen. So as some of you know that watch my previous episodes, I ended up paying off my mortgage in 2019, 7 years after I refinanced it. So I was able to save quite a bit of interest by doing so. And I did it because I wanted that big win. I wanted to say to myself, Self, you just paid off your mortgage. Congratulations. So back to this analysis, however, that $30,000 of expenses I had was heavily weighted, $1,200 a month of that 3,336 because I had a mortgage and that extra principal. Well, now, as you know, my true expenses in 2024, 13 years later, is only $20,000. I was able to reduce my expenses from $30,000 13 years later to $20,000. Most people go the opposite direction, don't they? So think about that. It's hard to do, but it's possible. Now, the net result of that, as I looked at the bigger numbers, it is true that I brought my expenses down $14,000 a year. So if you take 30 minus 14, remember 30,000 were my expenses in 2012. Well, now I reduced it by 14,000 because I paid off the mortgage, right, in 2019. That leaves 16,000, but we're going to add $4,000 more, not in other things that I bought per se, but because of inflation. Food is more expensive, gas is more expensive, etc. So 30 minus 14 is 16, but you add 4, you get 20. That's why my expenses right now are 20,000 as far as my true expenses, as opposed to 30. So, in thinking about wrapping up this episode, to again apply this to your life, do your best if you want to gain or get to financial independence as early as you possibly can. You need to start thinking again in these 5-year, 10-year, and even 15-year increments to think about what truly is possible. And if you have a dual income, many of you are probably making a lot more money than I was making. My salary in 2012 was $60,000 plus the bonus that brought me to about $70,000. But some of you might be making $100,000 or more. You might be spending a lot of money. Of course, we like to have wonderful places to live. We like to drive nice cars. But if you can just bring that down just a little bit and start thinking about building wealth as your primary goal. Because remember, you guys know I've talked about in the past, your income today, the primary reason for your income today really should be to fund, F-U-N-D, your future self. The secondary reason for your income today is to pay your expenses that you have today. But you've got to start thinking about and segueing into funding the life of choice that you may be in today, because my guess is that your future self will want to stop working and realizing and living off of the engine that you have created for yourself and your family.